And now, our final guest needs no introduction. The Reverend Al Sharpton is the founder and president of the National Action Network, or NAN. NAN has been marching and fighting for civil rights since 1991. Reverend Sharpton joined the Switch Up recently to talk about the anniversary of the march. Take a listen. Reverend, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to start off, first, we're 60 years out from when this first march took place, this March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What progress have we made so far, but where are we still lacking?
We, in 1963, when they had the march, they were marching at a time that there were still laws of segregation in the South. There was the strict Jim Crow that governed life in the country. Even in the North, there were aspects of it. There was the denial of the right to vote in most parts of the South for black people. There was, of course, therefore, the social ramifications of that. That march in '63 came after there had been student sit-ins, and there had been the assassination of Medgar Evers that June, and there had been things leading up to A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader, calling this march, and the NAACP, National Urban League, Dr. King, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they called them the Big Six, came together. And that march demonstrated the mass outrage of people of what was going on at that time. And you must remember, I think a lot of people forget, 250,000 people coming to Washington when they could not ride the front of buses above the Mason-Dixie line, when they couldn't use most restaurants along the road if you were black, where they couldn't use toilets in public places, yet they came anyway. So I think that mass outpouring showed the nation the outrage people had, which I think helped lead to the 64 voting rights, the Public Accommodations Act, the Civil Rights Act, which was only a year later, and then the Voting Rights Act 2 years later. We made progress. We now have, in effect, taken Jim Crow down. The Public Accommodations Act, the Civil Rights Act, where now, in 60 years later, we can fly first class, not only ride the front of a bus. We can check in five-star hotels if we have the money. We have public accommodations for the most part. We have the right to vote. We've elected a black president and re-elected him. We now have a vice president who is a woman of color, black woman. We have black corporate leaders. We have black billionaires. We have blacks in mainstream entertainment. So to say we haven't made progress is not true. But if you look at the en masse numbers, we are just as unemployed statistically. We almost double that of whites. We still have, in many states, the erosion of voting rights, where it's making it more difficult to vote.
I think what really stands out to me that you were just highlighting is how multiracial this march on the 26th, as you said, continuing the march for the 60 years is going to be. And that's absolutely incredible. I'd like to hear from you what, in this moment, the spirit of this march is. You mentioned, 60 years ago there was frustration, there was anger. How do you see the spirit of this year's march comparing to the one 60 years ago?
There is a lot of concern and some anger. When you wake up one morning and you're a woman and you no longer have the right to decide your body, that can cause anger. When you wake up one morning and have been told that some of your student debt is forgiven and the Supreme Court says the president can't do that, that could lead to anger. When you wake up one morning and all of a sudden the fact that your family, because you were a certain color, couldn't advance in education, so there was going to be affirmative action to try and equalize that gap in terms of being locked out of higher education. And all of a sudden they say, no, you can't do that. And they say that it is against the 14th Amendment to deal with the question of race. Well, then how do we deal with the racial gap? We're not behind because there was something genetically wrong with us. We're behind because by law, government enforced law, we couldn't go to certain schools. We didn't have access to certain things. So all of that ends, that could lead to anger. Our job is to channel that anger into constructive activism rather than destructive, saying we're going to just explode or implode. No, it's about being active in a constructive way, which is why Martin and Andrea and the rest of us in National Action Network have called this march.
What we're seeing right now is we're seeing some of those things. You mentioned Rosa Parks, and some of these names are being said, we can't talk about race in schools. We're not going to talk about identity. You can't talk that Rosa Parks was, arrested because of the law at that time. How does this affect the fight today for progress, but how did it affect even thinking about bringing this march together?
I think so much about when I see the try to remove black history, LGBT discussions, women history. It's almost like if we shut this down, people will not understand why we need to continue to make progress. So if you have a Governor DeSantis in Florida trying to make certain laws against certain books or banning certain books in other parts of the country, then the only conclusion you could have is that blacks were just inherently inferior. So we don't only need black history for black young kids. White kids need to understand what happened, and therefore we need to do these things now. It is depriving whites of understanding how we ended up in a society that we have different needs based on different circumstances. It's not to condemn people, it is to understand people so that we can move and equalize and work together. I never thought I would see a time where people would celebrate trying to erase and edit history. And I've been able to live through some of it. I joined the Civil Rights Movement in the North. I was not born in the South when I was 12 years old. And I lived to speak at Rosa Parks' funeral, and Aretha Franklin's, and James Brown, and Michael Jackson. So I'm looking at black history that I was able to live through. I was in South Africa when Mandela won for president, and I sat on the podium when Barack Obama was inaugurated first black president. So I feel an obligation to protect the history that even in my small part was a part of. And you're going to tell me we're not going to be able to tell those stories because that might make people uncomfortable? No, we need to tell people that despite the fact we were chattel slaves, we were able to struggle and get to a black president. That can be a glorious story, but you take the glory out of the story when you want to take the pain and the suffering out. And the whites that stood up as abolitionists with Frederick Douglass and that 100 years later marched with Martin Luther King. Tell the whole story. Anytime you have an edited story, you underestimate the intellect and ability of American people to understand our growth.
Yeah. Looking back, the March 60 years ago, you said it was March for Jobs and Freedom. What do those two ideas have to do with each other? But more than that, I think about freedom and the way people use it. What does freedom mean today when we talk about equality, when we talk about equity?
Freedom then meant being able to use public accommodations, being able to get a job to feed your family. Freedom today, in many ways, represents some growth of the same thing. It means the freedom to be equal to anyone else. Education, not being banned from certain access to higher education. So let me get this right. The Supreme Court says you cannot consider race as a factor, even though until a couple of generations ago you excluded. But you can be considered with legacy. Well, why do some people have legacies at higher education? Because their family had wealth that we couldn't have, and they could give money that we couldn't give, or their family could go to schools when we couldn't. That legacy was built in segregation. That legacy was built in elimination of certain people's rights. So if you combine the students in some of these high institutions that got there because of race was a factor. It wasn't the only factor because they had to have the grades and all the rest. If you took them numbers and compared it to the numbers of students that were there on legacy, the legacy would far outnumber them. Isn't it interesting that the Supreme Court didn't see anything wrong with that? And they didn't see anything wrong with race being a factor in the military. So I can go to the bunker, but I can't go to the dormitory. That is crazy. And that's why we're marching. That's what we're talking about, freedom now. Jobs, we're talking about we want the same ability to be able to go and get a job fairly that we were denied and that our parents and their parents were denied. 13 state attorney generals have written letters to 100 of the top Fortune 500 companies since the Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago, saying that you can no longer consider race in diversity, DEI programs. This is already happening. This is not a maybe this will happen if we don't march. No, this has already happened, which is why we march.
I think a lot about what we're seeing right now, the way that identities are being so highly politicized and these attacks that are happening at the same point. Why do you think there seems to be, for some folks, it feels like a resurgence of a lot of this hate, of as you said, with the Supreme Court rolling back these rights. Now we're saying, don't consider race, when you mentioned not even a full generation ago, they were considering race to not hire people, not let them in schools. What's causing this sudden renewed interest in this?
I think that there was this built-up resentment that people felt that they were threatened and their so-called superior position threatened them, and people played on that insecurity and just brought out what was subliminally inside. Donald Trump became the face of it, but he's not the cause of it. He brought out there were some elements there that had never died. And I think Trump made it acceptable because he brought it to a presidential level, talking about S-hole countries and referring to people in a disparaging way and women and disabled. So Trump, in many ways, was able to mainstream what people in the 60s and 50s and 40s could only do in the margins. When I was growing up, and I remember in '64, I was still a teenager, where Barry Goldwater was the Republican nominee. In your heart, you know I'm right. He implied certain things against Lyndon Johnson, who was pro-civil rights. Donald Trump said it straight out. Donald Trump bragged about, I put the Supreme Court justices there that did this to women's right to choose, that did this to affirmative action. It's become Main Street, which is why on August 26th, we coming down Main Street to say that you can turn back the clock, but you won't turn back time.
I think about the role of young people, and one of the moments that we think about with young people is thinking back on Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in his speech talking about his children and the dream that he had for his children to be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And I'm curious for you, that element of his speech is so constantly said in so many ways, including in the affirmative action case. We had heard supporters quote him in that. But what from that speech, in your mind, is overlooked at the same time when people are pulling that quote out?
I think that, you know, I'm a preacher and been one since I was a child. The I have a dream part, and in part of what you quoted, was the climax of the speech. What people miss is the meat of the speech, the content. He talked about, first of all, why was the march at Lincoln Memorial? And why is ours at Lincoln Memorial? Why wasn't it at the Washington Monument or the Jefferson Memorial? If you look at the speech, he said 100 years ago, 1963, 100 years ago, 1863, Mr. Lincoln, Lincoln Memorial, we're in the shadows of Mr. Lincoln. You signed the Emancipation Proclamation. You promised that we'd have equality. You promised freedom. Washington didn't make that promise. Jefferson didn't make that promise. That's why we go to Lincoln Memorial. That's why he went 100 years later in '63. That's why we go in there in 2023. What we miss is he said that America has given us, Mr. Lincoln, a promissory note that has bounced in the Bank of Justice. We missed that part. We are living in a time where we're asking America to live up to your promise. And we leave that out because to talk about that part of the speech, the bounced check, the unfulfilled promissory note, is to then have to deal with policy rather than poetry. We like the poetry. I have a dream. My four little children, that's good poetry. But what about the bounced check? What about the equality? What about the fairness? What about being able to have the same equal footing? That challenges us to do something. And I think, Mrs. King, his widow, that Martin III, when we became close and worked together for the last 25 years, his mother spent time kind of helping all of us, especially we get some of our rough edges off. And she used to say that don't just talk about the end of the speech, talk about the whole speech. And it's that content that we intend to drive on August 26th.
My last question for you. We have been in this fight, I think about, Frederick Douglass. You can go all the way back to the time that our ancestors were brought here. And as you yourself mentioned, you have been part of this movement since you were 12. What words of advice or hope or encouragement can you give folks today, in spite of attacks that we're seeing on Black history, on Black bodies, on Black voting rights? What do you want folks to feel, particularly coming out of your march?
The movement is a struggle, and the struggle is about a long-distance run. It's not going to be a 50-yard dash. So if history teaches us anything, you're going to make an advancement, and they're going to try to push you back. And you got to get used to the rhythm of struggle, forward, back, and keep going forward, back, and expect that. We were elated when Barack Obama was elected president. Never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. But it was followed by Donald Trump, which was the antithesis of that. We should have expected there was going to be some answer. So you don't not only give up because they push back, you expect to push back. So now you come with the answer to the pushback. That always happened. Dr. King, we started this conversation. Dr. King and others 60 years ago had their march. You know what happened right after the march? About a month and a half after the march, after 250,000 people, this tremendous march, I Have a Dream speech, they bombed the church in Birmingham and killed 4 girls during Sunday school. They could have said, after all of that, how could you do that? But they said, we're going to wipe our tears and keep going, and they still got the Civil Rights Act less than a year later. So there's going to be reaction. You prepare for the reaction, and you got to be stronger in your action than whatever reaction come your way. So yes, it is very precarious times that we're in, but look at where we came from. In 100 years, we went from being property where we didn't even know our names. Our names are the names of our slave master. I went and we researched it, the New York Daily News. My family was owned by Alexander Sharpton in Edgefield, South Carolina. I don't know my name. I know the name of my slave master. But I took his name in going out of the White House and negotiating for our people. That's a long journey in a century. We must continue that journey. You can't give up. We are stronger than they think we are. The only weakness we have is if we have a self-image of our being weaker than we really are.
Thank you so much to the Reverend Al Sharpton here talking about the March on Washington, but more than that, leaving us with a wonderful, inspirational message on how we continue forward. Reverend, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we will have video from the event up on our website, thehill.com, shortly. And please remember to subscribe to the Switch Up podcast. Links to find the Switch Up on major podcast platforms will be in the description on this video on YouTube and on thehill.com. I'm Cheyanne Daniels. Hope you enjoyed the program and have a great rest of your day.